Hello and welcome to the program. I am Folashade Ogurinde. After recording negative growth for 3 consecutive quarters in 2020, Nigeria has eased out of a recession as predicted by the Central Bank and the Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning. Nigeria's gross domestic product grew by 0.11% in real terms in the fourth quarter of 2020, representing the first positive quarterly growth in the last 3 quarters. The economy saw growth in agriculture and telecommunication sectors, which offset drop in oil production. Now, despite this positive outlook, Nigeria's headline inflation rate is still at a record high of 16.47% for January 2021. Now, to make sense of these numbers and the consequences on Nigeria's economic projections for 2021, I'm joined by senior economist Wilson Erumebo at the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, NESG. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. Now, what do you make of the NBS report of Nigeria's recession exit?
Well, first of all, I think one key point to note is that, we got into this recession mainly because of the fact that we had COVID, which affected economic activities. And secondly, because of the development in the oil industry. Like we all know, crude oil price declined significantly due to the impact of COVID and lockdown and social distancing, and other restrictions. So that led the economy into the recession. But this time, and why this recession is basically different from the one we experienced in 2016, if you look at the numbers, oil led Nigeria into the 2016 recession and brought Nigeria out of that recession. Because we started the economy, recorded positive growth when crude oil also exited and recorded positive growth. But this time, the story is different. The oil sector is still in decline. It recorded, a growth rate of minus 20%, which is, still quite huge in the fourth quarter of the year. But the economy in general recorded, positive growth. So what that means is that crude oil didn't lead us out of this current recession. But then, if you also look at the numbers, you notice, quite an improved performance of the non-oil sector, which means that sectors like agriculture, ICT, construction, and real estate, had some significant, impact in terms of leading Nigeria out of this current recession, especially, looking at production, because that's basically what GDP is about. I mean, there are so many other indicators that we use to measure the welfare of an economy, and GDP is just one of those indicators. There are indicators like inflation, reserves, and all that, which, are not necessarily doing well.
And now, I'm glad you spoke about those key sectors that drove Nigerian economic growth. We've always known that crude oil prices and the oil sector, like Nigeria basically had always looked up to the oil sector for economic growth. But, we saw in the Q4 reports for 2020, the information and communication, as well as agricultural, real estate, and mining and construction sectors actually drove GDP growth. But were you surprised by this outcome?
Well, not necessarily surprised because, a lot of people and even several organizations have said, economic performance measured by GDP growth will be better than what we had in 2020 Q3, that's in the third quarter of the year, especially because the fact that we had to, as a country, we had to, limit some of those lockdown rules. 20, the second quarter was even the worst, where we had lots of restrictions. We had to lock down several states to prevent the spread of COVID. But if you notice, from the second to the third and fourth quarter, some of those lockdown policies were limited and restricted, or eased, if you like. So that means that some sectors, there was some openings across the several sectors. Sectors that were restricted before started having some economic activities. Education is one of the sectors, the food and accommodation sectors, even travel as well, air transport and all that. So what that meant is that economic activities, started improving, over time as some of these policies were implemented and these lockdown and restrictions were lifted. So not necessarily surprised in the sense that what we had is better than, what we had in Q3, but a bit surprised in the sense that we had a positive growth this time. I mean, there were expectations as to maybe we could have a GDP growth of -1% or -0.1% and all that. But so the shocker here is the fact that we moved to the positive region, which, I mean, again, is something positive to note,
Oh, certainly, but you said, your expectations was not, in alliance to what, the report published. But what factors do you think actually helped this economic growth?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, some of the factors is the fact that we, opened up, allowed some sectors to operate. Education, schools resumed, in at some parts, but then we then had a second wave, which came in and disrupted activities again. But yeah, also, air transport activities in that sector also improved when the lockdown restrictions and travel restrictions were reduced or limited. So those were some of the key factors. But again, if you look at the GDP numbers, you'd see improved performance in sectors like ICT, in sectors like healthcare and agriculture. Recorded one of the strongest growth we've had in a long time. It's recorded a 3.4%, 42% growth, which is quite significant, especially when you look at the recent 3-4 years of performance. So that tells you that some of the sectors did well. Not many of the sectors recorded positive growth in the fourth quarter, because I think we had about 7 sectors that showed positive growth. But in general, many of the sectors did well. Some that recorded negative growth, the magnitude of contraction reduced. So you had sectors that were contracting at 40%, in the second and third quarter, but this time they contracted at around 5%, 2%, and all that. So that basically means that as activities, start picking up, we're seeing quite like a reflection on the GDP numbers. And there was, so much of interventions, government interventions, to support some of these industries. So if you had a combination of some of these factors is what led the economy to display this kind of growth we're seeing.
Well, certainly. The Nigerian Economic Summit Group, NESG, in early February projected an economic growth of 2.9% for 2021, with a GDP growth of 0.11%. Can Nigeria meet this expectation?
Yeah, so in our business as usual scenario, what we said was the economy would expand by 0.9%. Which means that we're looking at somewhere around a growth of 1%, for the whole of 2020. And with these GDP numbers, it means that that is very likely we can meet. And if you look at projections of several organizations like the IMF, the AFDB, the World Bank, even the federal government, there's several projections. All of these show that Nigeria would have exited the recession anyways in 2021. What the numbers just confirmed is that this is even happening earlier than anticipated. So yes, it's possible for Nigeria to meet the projections of 1% or 0.9% GDP growth. But again, and one of the things we've emphasized over time is that we often talk about GDP as if it's the only measure of economic progress, but it is not. There are so many other indicators, and we've emphasized the fact that Nigeria needs to start, talking and moving into the era of, achieving inclusive growth in a way that when GDP expands, we see a reflection of that in indicators like unemployment, in indicators like poverty rate, and so many other economic indicators, social economic indicators that actually affect the poor. If you would agree with me, inflation is one of the big concern in the economy right now. And if you are growing your GDP at, whatever, 1%, 2%, and prices keep increasing, it means that people would, certainly get more poorer by the day, because inflation basically erodes welfare and the income of Nigerians. So we're saying it's not just about GDP. GDP, yes, we need to expand, production needs to expand, but we need to look beyond that and look at other measures of welfare to ensure that the average Nigerians feels the impact of GDP growth.
Yeah, you made a very valid point, because this is something that's occurred over and over in Nigeria. We have a growth in GDP, which does not have any significant. It doesn't mirror the average Nigerians. Basic everyday life experiences. But we'll discuss all this and more after this short break. Please stay with us. Corruption not in my country.
Hello. Alahaji. Right now I'm in Abuja. No. Hello? Adamu. Right now I'm in Kano. Yes. When I get back, I will just call you. Look, what is wrong with you? I'm talking on the phone and you are gesticulating and doing. What's wrong with you?
Daddy, where exactly are we as we speak?
Are you alright? This is Lagos.
Well, you just lied to someone that we're in Abuja.
Keep quiet. Who told you can tell an elderly person is lying?
Daddy, you just lied. And by lying, you are raising corrupt children for the future of Nigeria. That is corruption, not in my country. Corruption not in my country.
Welcome back. Well, if you're just joining us, you've been watching Money Matters, and today we've been discussing Nigeria's recession exit, and we've been dissecting how these numbers and what these numbers actually mean for the Nigerian economy. And I've been talking with the senior economist Wilson Erumebo of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, NESG. Now, earlier, before we went for that break, you were talking about how there's usually a difference between Nigeria's economic growth and the reality of the Nigerian persons, like people in Nigeria. But let's take a look at what the NESG report said. It projected moderate inflation rate of 14.5%. However, the MBS reports an inflation rate of 16.47% for January 2021. What do you make of this?
Yes, so for inflation, and some of the figures you quoted from the NESG report, so what we often do is to provide three different pathways and three different options, for Nigeria, because sometimes we believe that, at the start of the year, and especially in a case where we have so much uncertainties, our projections are usually based on scenarios. So the inflation figure you quoted is for the best case scenario, which basically is driven by several assumptions, assuming that Nigeria is able to implement some of the tough reforms. By tough reforms, I mean address issues relating to insecurity, because insecurity has become a major burden and major issue affecting productivity of the agricultural sector. Assuming Nigeria is able to implement reforms that are able to reduce costs, cost of production. All the bottlenecks you face in transporting goods from one point to another, the number of checkpoints and, collecting monies for certain goods and all that. So addressing issues relating to foreign exchange. So those were the assumptions that led to the 14.5% or so that you mentioned for average inflation. But then there's a worst case, which is even higher than that. There's a moderate case, which is also higher than that, where we're talking about inflation rate at about 15, 16% and the likes. So it all depends on whether or not, as a country, we are ready to make some of those tough decisions. Whether we will, we would see in the course of the year what exactly, which reforms, the government could implement over time.
Now let's shift our attention a bit to the Nigerian oil and gas sector. Sustained rise in crude oil price is definitely affecting Nigeria's landing cost of petrol, which also affects local pump price of PMS. Now, with this development affects the NESG projection of Nigeria's economic growth.
Well, in terms of there's been lots of talk about subsidy, the fact that there's lots of corruption in the process. It's also a burden on the government to be able to meet up and get some of these monies that should have been used for infrastructure using to pay subsidies. And it's part of why the government took advantage of the situation, the fact that oil prices were low at the time, to remove subsidies. But again, I think there still needs to be lots of clarity. Right now, as at a couple of days ago, crude oil price has gotten to $63 per barrel, which is quite high as at the time when the subsidies were removed. And these were the concerns we raised on several forums, that are we really running or ready to operate a market system where prices will be driven by demand and supply and performance of crude oil prices? Or are there even issues? Because even in the report, we highlighted that these are some of the concerns that we'll face. Because you must bear in mind also the reality of the economy. I mean, part of why the inflation is moving at a rapid rate because of the fuel increase and its implication on transport and logistics costs. So we're also saying at a time where there's been so much pressure on citizens, with the COVID impact, so many Nigerians have lost their jobs. Perhaps this could be the time that government, takes some of these costs and absorbs them on its own rather than transferring them to the citizens. So there has to be a very clear and thought out plan and strategy as to how we can approach this, because bearing in mind that whatever happens, we're talking about the average Nigerian, we're talking about improving welfare of Nigerians. So, and you must also note that part of why subsidies is usually a problem in several countries is because of the burden it creates on government. And secondly, there are arguments that it limits productivity. For instance, if you subsidize a product, how sure are you that investment will come into the midstream, the setting up of refineries? Investors wouldn't want to put in so much money in refinery investment, especially when the price is capped at a certain level. And that's the essence of removing subsidy. But even with the subsidy removal, are we able to attract significant investments to Nigeria's into the refinery space? I think
And Mr. Erumebo, some have even argued that some experts have actually said that there is nothing like deregulation, true deregulation of the Nigerian oil sector, and they've also said that oil or petrol is not subsidized in the real sense.
Yeah, I mean there are concerns as to that, which raises the issue as to how clear are we, in terms of the direction we are taking. I mean, are we just doing things because several people are agitating, or have we thought out of a clear pathway? I mean, a medium to long term agenda and strategy to say, look, maybe for now, rather than full subsidy removal, are we going to implement a certain percentage and ensure that Nigerians are able to pick up over time? So some have argued for gradual removal, I mean, as opposed to outright removal, because ideally the price of crude should be increasing as we speak, especially the price of petrol, especially given the updates. So, but it's not. I mean, people are still selling at a fixed rate. Across several filling stations, you still see petrol being sold at a very the price difference is so negligible, especially in Lagos and in some parts. So yes, the concerns as to are we really practicing full deregulation? But the point I was trying to make earlier is everything has to be done holistically. We can't have removed subsidy and at the same time we're battling with issues relating to insecurity. How do you then attract investment into the midstream sector so that you can take advantage of what of the gains of subsidy removal? So I think we need to be able to, look at things holistically and plan it and chart a path for Nigeria going forward, as opposed to, always taking a knee-jerk reaction.
Well, certainly. Briefly, I want you to tell me, in a worst-case scenario, how much difference will NSG's four priorities of macroeconomic stability, regulatory consistency, sectoral reforms, and human capital development drive Nigeria's economy to full recovery?
It's going to have a lot of impact. It's going to lead us to a path of growth that delivers a reduction in poverty. And why we said so is because when you have a recession, what usually happens is there are several indicators and several areas that it affects. Especially when you also look at the fact that crude oil price decline, and you look at the nature of the Nigerian economy. For instance, one of the first areas is through FX. Causing a lot, the reserves, kept declining significantly. Exchange rates, we had to devalue on several occasions, and inflation kept going up. And these are what we call macroeconomic indicators. Those are the some of the indicators that get to show you that you're approaching a crisis mode. And what we are saying is the first priority amongst the four that we highlighted is macroeconomic stability. And we're saying, look, for us to get to the path of growth that delivers value, growth that delivers reduction in unemployment and poverty, we're saying the macroeconomy has to be stable, the macroeconomic environment. We're looking at things like inflation, we're looking at things like foreign exchange, addressing the issues as to having the different rates across, the wide differences across all the exchange rates. I mean, even having different exchange rates in the first place. We're talking about, having price stability. Not necessarily that the price would start falling, but ensuring that price is stable over time. So there are several, indicators we mapped out, to measure and ensure macroeconomic stability, and some reforms, as to harmonizing the FX rates, improving non-oil exports, trying to produce for exports, not just celebrating GDP growth as it were, improving exports to other countries so you can earn foreign exchange and improve the reserves condition. And that's on one hand. The second priority looks at policy and regulatory consistency. And we emphasized on that a lot, because if we're talking about investments being one of the key factors that would lead Nigeria out of into the path of high growth, we have to get our policy and regulatory environment right. We can't keep making policies and then we reverse those same policies in another pronouncement. There has to be sort of like an institutional approach to policy making. Before a policy comes out, what is the process like? Who has done the vetting? Have we taken all the necessary appraisals, done all the appraisals as to the industries that it will affect? Who are the winners? Who are the losers? And how best can we ensure the losers we limit the impact on the loser? So those are the kinds of things that we think needs to be in place to ensure that policies, we ensure consistency. We don't like a situation where a ministry says one thing and then another government agency counters that. It creates lots of uncertainties for investors, and we're saying this is critical and we must look into that.
Certainly, these are some of the issues that we hope the Nigerian government looks into. Just like someone has asked, will this recession exit be sustainable? But certainly this is something we have to look out for in 2021. But thank you very much, Senior Economist Wilson Erumebo of the Nigeria Economist Summit Group and NSG. Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
And that's it on the program. Thank you very much for watching. I am Fola Shadi Ogrindi.